Diplomacy is the cornerstone of a nation's success. If a nation has good diplomacy, they will likely excel on the global stage. In 1939, tensions in Europe were increasing rapidly and were coming to a head. With the dawn of the Second World War looming, all eyes were on Germany and their border with Poland. However, there was another, often forgotten conflict brewing. The Soviets had stationed troops on the Finnish border, preparing for a complete annexation of Finland, like they had done to Ukraine. There could have been no better time to strike, as the world had averted its eyes from the Russians, and the Finns would be on their own. Let's talk about how we got here. Finland, prior to 1917, was not an independent state. It was a protectorate of the Russian Empire. Following the October Revolution of 1917, Finland descended into a bloody civil war, with the communist Finnish Reds and the conservative Finnish Whites, as they were known, fighting for control of the country. The Whites won the civil war in May of 1918. White Finland, as it was known, was backed by support from the German Empire during the war. This can be seen as the source for Finland's close alliance with Germany it would have later on. Finland suffered from political instability following the Finnish Civil War. The new conservative government repressed communists in the country. The Communist Party of Finland was outlawed, and anti-communist violence was prevalent. Following the Civil War, Finland became increasingly nationalist, and its policy, known as Greater Finland, focused on reclaiming East Karelia. Back in Russia, the communist government was now in control after a brutal 5-year-long civil war, with Vladimir Lenin as its leader. Following his death in 1922, Joseph Stalin came to power as the premier of the Soviet Union. Stalin was a very paranoid man. Although the two countries had signed a non-aggression pact in 1932, the relationships between Finland and the USSR were strenuous at best. Stalin began to continually worry about the Soviet Union's security. He believed that Finland was lost territory and that Finland needed to be reclaimed due to territorial security. After all, the gleaming jewel of the Soviet Union, Leningrad, was only 20 miles away from the Finnish border, where Stalin believed German troops could be stationed for invasion. The real reason the Soviets wanted to declare war on Finland was not only to protect Leningrad, which was a side benefit, but to take Finland while the rest of the international community was focused on condemning Hitler and the annexation of Czechoslovakia, so that intervention was unlikely. On the 5th of October 1939, Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Vyacheslav Molotov requested that Finland send representatives to Moscow in order to discuss, in Soviet words, concrete political questions which have become urgent through the outbreak of war. On October 9th, the Finns had sent Juho Kusti Paasikivi to the negotiations table, along with other delegates. Paasikivi was instructed to deny any mutual assistance pacts, as the Finns believed they were a precursor to invasion and occupation. This was true, as the Soviets had snuffed out practically all independence movements in the Baltic states, which had similar assistance pacts presented to them. He was also told to uphold the idea that Finland would maintain its sovereignty at all costs. During this time, Finland was preparing for an invasion. Finnish reserves were called up, and the Finnish troops on the border were put on high alert. During the first round of negotiations on October 12th, the proposal of mutual assistance treaty was immediately turned down by Paasikivi. A separate proposal for an alliance was turned down as well. On October 14th, the next round of negotiations began. Stalin proposed that Finland would cede the Hanko Peninsula, multiple islands off the Gulf of Finland, and most importantly 70 kilometers of Finnish territory near Leningrad in exchange for land. The Finnish believed that these demands masked the true intentions of the Soviet Union, which they believed were a full invasion and annexation of Finland. Both sides would not give in, and eventually the Finnish diplomats returned to Helsinki to discuss a solution with the Finnish War Cabinet. They decided that the Soviet Union had valid reasons to be concerned about the safety of Leningrad. They deemed ceding a portion of the Karelian Isthmus and some islands in the Gulf of Finland as reasonable, but the debate of the Hanko Peninsula remained. With the Finnish counterproposal and Finnish Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner, Paasikivi returned to Moscow on October 21st. On the 23rd of October, Stalin read the Finnish response but did not agree to it, as his initial proposed demands were the minimum of what seemed acceptable to the Soviet Union. During this time, reports of Soviet troops massing on the border were received by Finnish generals. The delegates returned to Helsinki to discuss the Soviet demands once again. Back in Helsinki, Paasikivi stated that another rejection of the Soviets' demands could be a cause for war. Tanner agreed, but also stated that giving the Hanko to the Soviet Union would be humiliating for Finland and could possibly cost Finland its sovereignty. On the 4th of November 1939, the final round of talks was in action. Stalin offered an alternative to the secession of Hanko, which was ceding islands near it. The delegation contacted the Finnish War Cabinet with a new offer, but was rejected, with the War Cabinet believing that any Soviet military presence on Finnish territory was a threat to its sovereignty. Finland's final response to the Soviet offer was that Finland could not grant any foreign power military bases either on its territory or within its borders. The two sides were stuck in diplomatic stalemate, and all diplomacy broke down. War was inevitable. This demonstrates the consequences of failed diplomacy, as debate had broken down almost immediately due to Soviets' aggressive foreign policy and the inability of both sides to decide on a compromise. In times where diplomacy fails, war is the only option. Soviet forces launched a false flag operation by shelling the town of Mainila to justify an invasion. Claiming that the Finns had shelled them, Soviet troops crossed the border. At the start of the invasion, the Soviets didn't immediately find trouble. Soon, however, trouble would find them. The Red Army was stopped dead in its tracks, and the Finnish army inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets throughout the winter of 1939 to 1940. However, in the end, the Finns sued for peace under stress from the Soviet invasion. Both sides had inflicted heavy losses on each other, and the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. The treaty made Finland cede half of Finnish Karelia, including its industrial center of Viipuri, lease Hanko to the Soviet Union, and cede the islands near the Gulf of Finland, which was far more than what the Soviets had demanded pre-war. The Finns were right about the true intentions of Russia. After the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, neither side was willing to break the tension that had been built up before the Winter War. Following the Winter War, the Finns were angered by Russian demands. The Finns had to cede most of their industry-rich heartland and had to pay hefty reparations, which pushed the Finns even closer to Germany diplomatically and towards a possible alliance. The interim peace was a period in the history of Finland between the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty and the start of Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union by the Axis powers hadn't started yet. This awkward limbo between the two parts of the Second World War was a very disturbed peace, in which the Soviets pushed the Finns towards Germany diplomatically. The Finns, seeing that if Germany potentially attacked the Soviet Union, realized they might reclaim the land they lost during the Winter War. When Operation Barbarossa started, it wasn't just the Germans who attacked the Russians, it was the Finns as well. The second war between the Russians and the Finns would be called the Continuation War, in which the Finns would see great advancement during the beginning of the war and would also be able to take most of the Karelian Isthmus, but would be pushed back by a major Soviet offensive in 1944. The Finns would eventually be forced to sign a treaty, which included returning to the borders agreed upon in the 1940 Treaty of Moscow, war reparations, kicking the Germans out of Finland, and the Finns would have to cede Petsamo to the USSR. Finland after the Continuation War would end up as a part of the Russian sphere of influence. The Finns had to side with the Russians in times of diplomatic crises, or else pay the consequences. Ultimately, Finland maintained its independence at the cost of needing to side with the Soviet Union in diplomatic affairs to maintain it. We can draw many comparisons from the Finnish-Soviet conflict to current world affairs between Russia and Ukraine. With Russia stationing troops on Ukraine, one cannot help but look back on the failed diplomacy between the Finns and the Russians in 1939. Diplomacy itself is a war of words. When diplomacy fails, blood is spilled. As always, the key to the success of a nation is its diplomacy.